Hello and welcome to Inside Judicial Watch. I'm your host, Bruce Schlesman. With me today we have Bob Popper, one of our senior attorneys here at Judicial Watch and the director of the Election Integrity Project. Thanks so much for coming by.
Thanks for having me, Bruce.
Of course. So, California, we recently sued LA County. Do you want to tell us a little bit about that lawsuit and kind of the background of what's going on?
Sure. We learned that California had not been complying with the National Voter Registration Act. And this is a federal law that makes states have to monitor their voter rolls to make sure that everyone on the voter rolls is actually eligible to vote. And they hadn't been complying with the key portion of that bill, of that law, for 20 years. And they hadn't been doing this because the Clinton Justice Department under Janet Reno compelled then Governor Pete Wilson to stop applying that part of the law. I think the theory was at the time that it was understood in a different way, but the bottom line was that they hadn't been doing what the rest of the country has been doing, with some notable exceptions, for 20 years. What you have to do is send notices to people and ask them, are you still registered in our state? This is if you believe they might have moved somewhere else, if you believe they're no longer eligible to vote. And then once you do that, after a period of time equal to 2 general federal elections, 2 to 4 years, you remove them from the voter rolls. And it's not any great life-changing event. If for some reason they move back to California or they're still there for some reason and went through all the cracks somehow and were missed, you just re-register. But the idea is that most of the people who you can't get in touch with really have moved out of state. Well, Los Angeles County hasn't been doing this for 20 years. And we discovered this, and we discovered that they have what we call inactive registrations in the huge numbers, 1.5 million plus. To give you an idea how many inactive registrations that is, 1.5 million, the number itself is larger than the total population of 10 individual United States. Los Angeles County has more inactive voters on its voter rolls than the entire state of Hawaii has people.
That's crazy.
Infants and non-citizens. It is a huge number, and that's what you do when you don't enforce the law for 20 years. That's the kind of thing that happens. Well, under our settlement agreement, we sued them over this, and we reached a settlement without having to go to court. I think because the merits were pretty clear. And at the same time, the Supreme Court last summer issued a ruling that explained that, yes, the Janet Reno Justice Department had it wrong. That is not what the statute says, which we believed all along. No. You do have to remove these people. You can't just keep them on the voter rolls. And, again, it takes an active imagination to think of what has actually happened in Los Angeles County by not enforcing this law. They have about 5.2 or 3 million active voters, actual voters who live there and are registered. They have 1.5 million inactive registrants, and they may have been inactive for decades. These may include people who've moved out of state to another United state. These may include people who moved out of the country to France and then died. I mean, a lot happens in 20 years. So these 1.5 million registrations are not good registrations. Most likely, but pursuant to federal law, they all get a letter saying, do you still live here? And that's step one. And then after the statutory period of time, they can be removed. Well, just before I came out here, I got a communication from Los Angeles County indicating that they had in fact sent, it now amounts to 1.6 million cards to registered voters' last addresses, asking them if they're still registered to vote, if they're still living in that location.
So the process has started.
The process has started for just a huge number of people. I mean, this is probably the largest mailing ever undertaken under the National Voter Registration Act.
Wow.
One way to look at it is, it's as if the National Voter Registration Act just got applied in California for the first time. I mean, the law was only adopted in 1993. So that means within 5 or 6 years, they stopped applying it in California and are applying it again, thanks to us.
All right, well, that's obviously a huge update. And so with this, they call, they tell you they're sending out the cards. What comes?
They tell us they've sent them.
They sent them. So,
Yes.
so what comes next?
Well, you get responses. I mean, a small proportion, and it's hard to predict, but it's, less than 10%, usually less than 5%, write back and say, yes, we still live here.
Okay.
I mean, in some states, it's as low as 1%. So you get the responses, and those people are not removed from the rolls, and they don't have to do anything else. They're active registrants again.
Okay.
For the vast majority, what happens is you wait for the duration of 2 general federal elections and see if they vote and see if they show up, and if they don't, they're removed. But it's a process. It's a lengthy process for a reason. You don't want to make a mistake. You don't want to throw anyone off the rolls who really lives there or who hasn't moved.
Absolutely.
But taking into account all of the protections, then at least they're enforcing the law, and they've started to enforce the law thanks to our lawsuit.
I want to pivot to ballot harvesting, which is obviously a big issue. It's going on in California right now. What are we doing about that?
Well, ballot harvesting is, there was an amendment, I think at the time it was relatively little noticed, an amendment to California law. California, before the ballot harvesting law was adopted in 2016, had a law like most other states where if you had a relative who couldn't make it to the polls, you could take their ballot either to an election official or you could mail it for them. If you had someone in your house who couldn't make it to the polls, a roommate, someone you're sharing a residence with, same thing, you could take it for them. And there were restrictions in California law that what you could not do was gin up an operation like a campaign and hire people to go and get people's ballots. You couldn't do that. So this was only for people whom you knew who couldn't make it to the polls, who you knew who couldn't make it there. And that law was changed in 2 significant ways. First, it was provided that campaigns now can hire people to go door to door. So of course you're going to see a lot more of that. And then the second change was even more momentous. It said, the law was changed to say that you can collect anyone's ballot, including people you don't know, including people who never invited you to come to their house and try to collect their ballot. Well, what happens? People show up all over the neighborhood, in a given neighborhood. They're hired by campaigns, they're hired by ideological groups, they're hired by unions. They go door to door, they collect ballots, they pressure people for their ballots, they pressure them to vote a certain way, they ask them who they're going to vote for. It can become an ugly practice. And the clerk of Orange County reported that people were coming in with armloads of 100 and 200 ballots that they had received from people and turning them in. The state doesn't track who collects them. The state doesn't track who turned their ballots into a ballot harvester. They only track whether a vote ultimately was counted. They don't know anything about the practice. The state is sort of willfully ignorant of what's going on. All they see is the final ballot. So it's a very problematic practice. I would say the way that it ties into what we did in our settlement was, if you have inactive registrations, that means that someone's living somewhere else, possibly dead, as I said, perhaps out of the country, and it makes it easier to commit fraud. It takes some courage, I would say. Not the good kind of courage, but it takes some courage to walk into a polling place and pretend you're not who you are and cast someone else's ballot. There are people there. You might be, the people behind the desk might know the person. It's possible. Other people in line might know the person, and they might say, you're not that person. You're subject to being detained and arrested if you're found on the spot to have committed fraud. It's not a great check. It's probably not enough in my view, but it's something. Well, if you're at a residence that receives a ballot for someone who doesn't live there anymore, and you take that ballot and you vote it, or if you just have a ballot, if if you acquire some unfilled out ballot and fill it out in the name of someone who's no longer living in the state, and you mail it, that takes no courage at all. Even a coward can commit that kind of fraud. And so ballot harvesting ties into inactive registrations because the law allowing ballot harvesters also allows counties to choose to send vote-by-mail ballots to everyone in the county. And Los Angeles County has chosen to do that. Everyone is going to be getting a vote-by-mail ballot. And so there will be more of them floating around and more opportunities to commit this sort of cowardly fraud that doesn't require you to stick your neck out as much.
Where does Judicial Watch go from here?
Well, we continue to enforce the National Voter Registration Act. I don't know that any state will ever have 1.6 million inactive registrants again.
I'd hope not.
I would hope not. There are other counties that have more than 1 million inactive registrants. There's what I consider to be low-hanging fruit when you're looking for places to enforce the NVRA. We continue to do that kind of work. And just as a side note, I would point out another accomplishment that we recently learned of, which is that the state of Kentucky is sending out 250,000 similar postcards under a settlement that they have with us. We sued the state as well, to people who have moved elsewhere. It's not as massive as 1.6 million, but they had been enforcing the NVRA a little bit better than Los Angeles County. We also are looking at ballot harvesting. We're trying to understand how the practice can be made better and reasonable and how it can be challenged in court. And so that's something that we're analyzing.
Well, thank you so much for coming by and
Sure.
walking us through this very important issue.
Thanks for having me.
Thank you for joining us on Inside Judicial Watch. If you enjoyed this episode, please go watch more on our website or YouTube and subscribe to us on YouTube, like us on Facebook, follow us on Twitter, and follow us on Instagram. And of course, if you support our work, please donate. Thanks so much for joining us.